Chapter 49. Time gradually heals all wounds, and in less than a year it was difficult to discern any trace of the fierce whirlwind of passion which had devastated the peaceful valley of the Oiselle. What remained to attest the reality of all these events, which, though they were so recent, had already been relegated to the domain of the legendary? A charred ruin on the Ricci. A grave in the cemetery, upon which was inscribed, Marie-Anne Lacheneur, died at the age of 20. Pray for her. Only a few, the oldest men and the politicians of the village, forgot their solicitude in regard to the crops to remember this episode. Sometimes, during the long winter evenings, when they had gathered at the Boeuf Couronne, they laid down their greasy cards and gravely discussed the events of the past years. They never failed to remark that almost all the actors in that bloody drama at Montaignac had, in common parlance, come to a bad end. Victors and vanquished seemed to be pursued by the same inexorable fatality. Look at the names already upon the fatal list. Lacheneur, beheaded. Chanlouineau, shot. Marie-Anne, poisoned. Chupin, the traitor, assassinated. The Marquis de Courtornieu lived, or rather survived, but death would have seemed a mercy in comparison with such total annihilation of intelligence. He had fallen below the level of the brute, which is, at least, endowed with instinct. Since the departure of his daughter he had been cared for by 2 servants, who did not allow him to give them much trouble, and when they desired to go out they shut him up, not in his chamber, but in the cellar, to prevent his ravings and shrieks from being heard from without. If people supposed for a while that the Sermouse would escape the fate of the others, they were mistaken. It was not long before the curse fell upon them. One fine morning in the month of December, the Duke left the château to take part in a wolf hunt in the neighborhood. At nightfall, his horse returned, panting, covered with foam, and riderless. What had become of its master? A search was instituted at once, and all night long 20 men, bearing torches, wandered through the woods, shouting and calling at the top of their voices. 5 days went by, and the search for the missing man was almost abandoned, when a shepherd lad, pale with fear, came to the chateau one morning to tell them that he had discovered, at the base of a precipice, the bloody and mangled body of the Duc de Sermouse. It seemed strange that such an excellent rider should have met with such a fate. There might have been some doubt as to its being an accident, had it not been for the explanation given by the grooms. The Duke was riding an exceedingly vicious beast, said these men. She was always taking fright and shying at everything. The following week Jean Lacheneur left the neighborhood. The conduct of this singular man had caused much comment. When Marie-Anne died, he at first refused his inheritance. I wish nothing that came to her through Chanlouineau, he said everywhere, thus calumniating the memory of his sister as he had calumniated her when alive. Then, after a short absence, and without any apparent reason, he suddenly changed his mind. He not only accepted the property, but made all possible haste to obtain possession of it. He made many excuses. And, if one might believe him, he was not acting in his own interest, but merely conforming to the wishes of his deceased sister, and he declared that not a penny would go into his pockets. This much is certain, as soon as he obtained legal possession of the estate, he sold all the property, troubling himself but little in regard to the price he received, provided the purchasers paid cash. He reserved only the furniture of the sumptuously adorned chamber at the Borderie. These articles he burned. This strange act was the talk of the neighborhood. The poor young man has lost his reason, was the almost universal opinion. And those who doubted it no longer when it became known that Jean Lacheneur had formed an engagement with a company of strolling players who stopped at Montaignac for a few days. But the young man had not wanted for good advice and kind friends. M. d'Escorval and the Abbé had exerted all their eloquence to induce him to return to Paris, and complete his studies, but in vain. The necessity for concealment no longer existed, either in the case of the Baron or the priest. Thanks to Marshal de Sermouse they were now installed, the one in the presbytery, the other at Escorval, as in days gone by. Acquitted at his new trial, restored to the possession of his property, reminded of his frightful fall only by a very slight lameness, the Baron would have deemed himself a fortunate man, had it not been for his great anxiety on his son's account. Poor Maurice! His heart was broken by the sound of the clods of earth falling upon Marie-Anne's coffin, and his very life now seemed dependent upon the hope of finding his child. Assured of the powerful assistance of Abbé Midden, he had confessed all to his father, and confided his secret to Corporal Bavois, who was an honored guest at Escorval, and these devoted friends had promised him all possible aid. The task was very difficult, however, and certain resolutions on the part of Maurice greatly diminished the chance of success. Unlike Jean, he was determined to guard religiously the honor of the dead. And he had made his friends promise that Marie-Anne's name should not be mentioned in prosecuting the search. "We shall succeed, all the same," said the abbé, kindly, "with time and patience any mystery can be solved." He divided the department into a certain number of districts. Then one of the little band went each day from house to house questioning the inmates, but not without extreme caution, for fear of arousing suspicion, for a peasant becomes intractable at once if his suspicions are aroused. But the weeks went by, and the quest was fruitless. Maurice was deeply discouraged. "My child died on coming into the world," he said, again and again. But the abbé reassured him. "I am morally certain that such was not the case," he replied. "I know, by Marie-Anne's absence, the date of her child's birth. I saw her after her recovery, she was comparatively gay and smiling. Draw your own conclusions. And yet there is not a nook or corner for miles around which we have not explored. True, but we must extend the circle of our investigations." The priest, now, was only striving to gain time, knowing full well that it is the sovereign balm for all sorrows. His confidence, which had been very great at first, had been sensibly diminished by the responses of an old woman, who passed for one of the greatest gossips in the community. Adroitly interrogated, the worthy dame replied that she knew nothing of such a child, but that there must be one in the neighborhood, since it was the third time she had been questioned on the subject. Intense as was his surprise, the abbé succeeded in hiding it. He set the old gossip to talking, and after a 2 hours' conversation, he arrived at the conclusion that 2 persons besides Maurice were searching for Marie-Anne's child. Why, with what aim, and who these persons could be the abbé was unable to ascertain. Ah! Rascals have their uses after all, he thought. If we only had a man like Chupin to set upon the track. But the old poacher was dead, and his eldest son, the one who knew Blanche de Courtornieu's secret, was in Paris. Only the widow and the second son remained in Sermeuse. They had not, as yet, succeeded in discovering the 20,000 francs, but the fever for gold was burning in their veins, and they persisted in their search. From morning until night the mother and son toiled on, until the earth around their hut had been explored to the depth of 6 feet. A word dropped by a peasant one day put an end to these researches. "Really, my boy," he said, addressing young Chupin, "I did not suppose you were such a fool as to persist in hunting birds' nests after the birds have flown. Your brother, who is in Paris, can undoubtedly tell you where the treasure was concealed." The younger Chupin uttered the fierce roar of a wild beast. "Holy Virgin! You are right," he exclaimed. "Wait until I get money enough to take me to Paris, and we will see." Chapter 50. Marshal de Sermeuse' unexpected visit to the Château de Courtornieu had alarmed Aunt Medea even more than Blanche. In 10 seconds, more ideas passed through her brain than had visited it for 10 years. She saw the gendarmes at the château, she saw her niece arrested, incarcerated in the Montaignac prison, and brought before the court of assizes. If this were all she had to fear. But suppose she, too, were compromised, suspected of complicity, dragged before the judge, and even accused of being the sole culprit. Finding the suspense intolerable, she left her room. And, stealing on tiptoe to the great drawing-room, she applied her ear to the door of the little blue salon, in which Blanche and Marshal were seated. The conversation which she heard convinced her that her fears were groundless. She drew a long breath, as if a mighty burden had been lifted from her breast. But a new idea, which was to grow, flourish, and bear fruit, had just taken root in her brain. When Marshall left the room, Aunt Medea at once opened the communicating door and entered the blue salon, thus avowing that she had been a listener. 24 hours earlier she would not have dreamed of committing such an enormity. "Well, Blanche, we were frightened at nothing," she exclaimed. Blanche did not reply. She was deliberating, forcing herself to weigh the probable consequences of all these events which had succeeded each other with such marvelous rapidity. "Perhaps the hour of my revenge is almost here," murmured Blanche, as if communing with herself. "What do you say?" inquired Aunt Medea, with evident curiosity. "I say, Aunt, that in less than a month I shall be Marquise de Sairmeuse in reality as well as in name. My husband will return to me, and then, oh, then." "God grant it," said Aunt Medea, hypocritically. In her secret heart she had but little faith in this prediction, and whether it was realized or not mattered little to her. "Still another proof that your jealousy led you astray. And that what you did at the Borderie was unnecessary," she said, in that low tone that accomplices always use in speaking of their crime. Such had been the opinion of Blanche. But she now shook her head, and gloomily replied. "You are wrong, that which took place at the Borderie has restored my husband to me. I understand it all, now. It is true that Marianne was not Marshall's mistress, but Marshall loved her. He loved her, and the rebuffs which he received only increased his passion. It was for her sake that he abandoned me, and never, while she lived, would he have thought of me. His emotion on seeing me was the remnant of the emotion which had been awakened by another. His tenderness was only the expression of his sorrow. Whatever happens, I shall have only her leavings, what she has disdained." The young marquise added, bitterly, and her eyes flashed, and she stamped her foot in ungovernable anger. "And shall I regret what I have done?" she exclaimed. "Never. No, never." From that moment, she was herself again, brave and determined. But horrible fears assailed her when the inquest began. Officials came from Montagnac charged with investigating the affair. They examined a host of witnesses, and there was even talk of sending to Paris for one of those detectives skilled in unraveling all the mysteries of crime. Aunt Medea was half crazed with terror. And her fear was so apparent that it caused Blanche great anxiety. "You will end by betraying us," she remarked, one evening. "Ah! My terror is beyond my control. If that is the case, do not leave your room. It would be more prudent, certainly. You can say that you are not well, your meals shall be served in your own apartment." Aunt Medea's face brightened. In her inmost heart she was enraptured. To have her meals served in her own room, in her bed in the morning, and on a little table by the fire in the evening, had long been the ambition and the dream of the poor dependent. But how to accomplish it? 2 or 3 times, being a trifle indisposed, she had ventured to ask if her breakfast might be brought to her room, but her request had been harshly refused. "If Aunt Medea is hungry, she will come down and take her place at the table as usual," had been the response of Madame Blanche. To be treated in this way in a chateau where there were a dozen servants standing about idle was hard indeed. But now, every morning, in obedience to a formal order from Blanche, the cook came up to receive Aunt Medea's commands. She was permitted to dictate the bill of fare each day, and to order the dishes that she preferred. These new joys awakened many strange thoughts in her mind, and dissipated much of the regret which she had felt for the crime at the Borderie. The inquest was the subject of all her conversation with her niece. They had all the latest information in regard to the facts developed by the investigation through the butler, who took a great interest in such matters, and who had won the goodwill of the agents from Montagnac by making them familiar with the contents of his wine cellar. Through him, Blanche and her aunt learned that suspicion pointed to the deceased Chupin. Had he not been seen prowling around the Borderie on the very evening that the crime was committed? The testimony of the young peasant who had warned Jean Lacheneur seemed decisive. The motive was evident, at least, everyone thought so. 20 persons had heard Chupin declare, with frightful oaths, that he should never be tranquil in mind while a Lacheneur was left upon earth. So that which might have ruined Blanche, saved her. And the death of the old poacher seemed really providential. Why should she suspect that Chupin had revealed her secret before his death? When the butler told her that the judges and the police agents had returned to Montagnac, she had great difficulty in concealing her joy. There is no longer anything to fear, she said to Aunt Medea. She had, indeed, escaped the justice of man. There remained the justice of God. A few weeks before, this thought of the justice of God might, perhaps, have brought a smile to the lips of Madame Blanche. She then regarded it as an imaginary evil, designed to hold timorous spirits in check. On the morning that followed her crime, she almost shrugged her shoulders at the thought of Marie-Anne's dying threats. She remembered her promise, but she did not intend to fulfill it. She had considered the matter, and she saw the terrible risk to which she exposed herself if she endeavored to find the missing child. The father will be sure to discover it, she thought. But she was to realize the power of her victim's threats that same evening. Overcome with fatigue, she retired to her room at an early hour, and instead of reading, as she was accustomed to do before retiring, she extinguished her candle as soon as she had undressed, saying, "I must sleep." But sleep had fled. Her crime was ever in her thoughts, it rose before her in all its horror and atrocity. She knew that she was lying upon her bed, at Courtornieu. And yet it seemed as if she was there in Chanlouineau's house, pouring out poison, then watching its effects, concealed in the dressing-room. She was struggling against these thoughts. She was exerting all her strength of will to drive away these terrible memories, when she thought she heard the key turn in the lock. She lifted her head from the pillow with a start. Then, by the uncertain light of her night lamp, she thought she saw the door open slowly and noiselessly. Marie-Anne entered, gliding in like a phantom. She seated herself in an armchair near the bed. Great tears were rolling down her cheeks, and she looked sadly, yet threateningly, around her. The murderess hid her face under the bed covers, and her whole body was bathed in an icy perspiration. For her, this was not a mere apparition, it was a frightful reality. But hers was not a nature to submit unresistingly to such an impression. She shook off the stupor that was creeping over her, and tried to reason with herself aloud, as if the sound of her voice would reassure her. "I am dreaming," she said. "Do the dead return to life? Am I childish enough to be frightened by phantoms born of my own imaginations?" She said this, but the phantom did not disappear. She shut her eyes, but still she saw it through her closed eyelids, through the coverings which she had drawn up over her head, she saw it still. Not until daybreak did Madame Blanche fall asleep. And it was the same the next night, and the night following that, and always, and the terrors of each night were augmented by the terrors of the nights which had preceded it. During the day, in the bright sunshine, she regained her courage, and became skeptical again. Then she railed at herself. "To be afraid of something that does not exist, is folly," she said, vehemently. "Tonight I will conquer my absurd weakness." But when evening came all her brave resolution vanished, and the same fear seized her when night appeared with its cortege of spectres. It is true that Madame Blanche attributed her tortures at night to the disquietude she suffered during the day. For the officials were at Sermeuse then, and she trembled. A mere nothing might divert suspicion from Chupin and direct it toward her. What if some peasant had seen her with Chupin? What if some trifling circumstance should furnish a clue which would lead straight to Courtornieu? When the investigation is over, I shall forget, she thought. It ended, but she did not forget. Darwin has said, "It is when their safety is assured that great criminals really feel remorse." Madame Blanche might have vouched for the truth of this assertion, made by the most profound thinker and closest observer of the age. And yet, the agony she was enduring did not make her abandon, for a single moment, the plan she had conceived on the day of Martial's visit. She played her part so well, that, deeply moved, almost repentant, he returned 5 or 6 times, and at last, one day, he besought her to allow him to remain. But even the joy of this triumph did not restore her peace of mind. Between her and her husband rose that dread apparition, and Marie-Anne's distorted features were ever before her. She knew only too well that this heartbroken man had no love to give her, and that she would never have the slightest influence over him. And to crown all, to her already intolerable sufferings was added another, more poignant than all the rest. Speaking one evening of Marie-Anne's death, Martial forgot himself, and spoke of his oath of vengeance. He deeply regretted that Chupin was dead, he remarked, for he should have experienced an intense delight in making the wretch who murdered her die a lingering death in the midst of the most frightful tortures. He spoke with extreme violence and in a voice vibrant with his still powerful passion. And Blanche, in terror, asked herself what would be her fate if her husband ever discovered that she was the culprit, and he might discover it. She now began to regret that she had not kept the promise she had made to her victim, and she resolved to commence the search for Marie-Anne's child. To do this effectually it was necessary for her to be in a large city, Paris, for example, where she could procure discreet and skillful agents. It was necessary to persuade Martial to remove to the capital. Aided by the Duc de Sermeuse, she did not find this a very difficult task, and one morning, Madame Blanche, with a radiant face, announced to Aunt Medea. "Aunt, we leave just 1 week from today." Chapter 51. Beset by 1,000 fears and anxieties, Blanche had failed to notice that Aunt Medea was no longer the same. The change, it is true, had been gradual. It had not struck the servants, but it was none the less positive and real, and it betrayed itself in numberless trifles. For example, though the poor dependent still retained her humble, resigned manner. She had lost, little by little, the servile fear that had showed itself in her every movement. She no longer trembled when anyone addressed her, and there was occasionally a ring of independence in her voice. If visitors were present, she no longer kept herself modestly in the background, but drew forward her chair and took part in the conversation. At table, she allowed her preferences and her dislikes to appear. On 2 or 3 occasions she had ventured to differ from her niece in opinion, and had even been so bold as to question the propriety of some of her orders. Once Madame Blanche, on going out, asked Aunt Medea to accompany her. But the latter declared she had a cold, and remained at home. And, on the following Sunday, although Blanche did not wish to attend vespers, Aunt Medea declared her intention of going. And as it rained, she requested the coachman to harness the horses to the carriage, which was done. All this was nothing, in appearance; in reality, it was monstrous, amazing. It was quite plain that the humble relative was becoming bold, even audacious, in her demands. As this departure, which her niece had just announced so gaily, had never been discussed before her, she was greatly surprised. "What? You are going away," she repeated, "you are leaving Courtornieu? And without regret? To go where, pray?" "To Paris. We shall reside there, that is decided. That is the place for my husband. His name, his fortune, his talents, the favor of the king, assure him a high position there. He will repurchase the Hôtel de Sermeuse, and furnish it magnificently. We shall have a princely establishment." All the torments of envy were visible upon Aunt Medea's countenance. "And what is to become of me?" she asked, in plaintive tones. "You, aunt. You will remain here, you will be mistress of the chateau. A trustworthy person must remain to watch over my poor father. You will be happy and contented here, I hope." But no, Aunt Medea did not seem satisfied. "I shall never have courage to stay all alone in this great chateau," she whined. "You foolish woman! Will you not have the servants, the gardeners, and the concierge to protect you? That makes no difference. I am afraid of insane people. When the Marquis began to rave and howl this evening, I felt as if I should go mad myself." Blanche shrugged her shoulders. "What do you wish, then?" she asked, in a still more sarcastic manner. I wondered, if you would not take me with you. To Paris. You are crazy, I do believe. What would you do there? Blanche, I entreat you, I beseech you, to do so. Impossible, aunt, impossible. Aunt Medea seemed to be in despair. And what if I should tell you that I cannot remain here, that I dare not, that I should die? A flush of impatience dyed the cheek of Madame Blanche. You weary me beyond endurance, she said, rudely. And with a gesture that increased the harshness of her words, she added. If Courtornieu displeases you so much, there is nothing to prevent you from seeking a home more to your taste. You are free and of age. Aunt Medea turned very pale, and she bit her lips until the blood came. That is to say, she said, at last, you permit me to take my choice between dying of fear at Courtornieu and ending my days in a hospital. Thanks, my niece, thanks. That is like you. I expected nothing less of you. Thanks. She raised her head, and a dangerous light gleamed in her eyes. There was the hiss of a serpent in the voice in which she continued. Very well. This decides me. I entreated you, and you brutally refused to heed my prayer. Now I command and I say, I will go. Yes, I intend to go with you to Paris, and I shall go. Ah! It surprises you to hear poor, meek, much abused Aunt Medea speak in this way. I have endured in silence for a long time, but I have rebelled at last. My life in this house has been a hell. It is true that you have given me shelter, that you have fed and lodged me, but you have taken my entire life in exchange. What servant ever endured what I have endured? Have you ever treated one of your maids as you have treated me, your own flesh and blood? And I have had no wages. On the contrary, I was expected to be grateful since I lived by your tolerance. Ah! You have made me pay dearly for the crime of being poor. How you have insulted me, humiliated me, trampled me underfoot. She paused. The bitter rancor which had been accumulating for years fairly choked her. But after a moment she resumed, in a tone of intense irony. You ask me what would I do in Paris? I, too, would enjoy myself. What will you do, yourself? You will go to court, to balls, and to the play, will you not? Very well, I will accompany you. I will attend these fêtes. I will have handsome toilets, I, poor Aunt Medea, who have never seen myself in anything but shabby black woolen dresses. Have you ever thought of giving me the pleasure of possessing a handsome dress? Yes, twice a year, perhaps, you have given me a black silk, recommending me to take good care of it. But it was not for my sake that you went to this expense. It was for your own sake, and in order that your poor relation should do honor to your generosity. You dressed me in it, as you sew gold lace upon the clothing of your lackeys, through vanity. And I endured all this. I made myself insignificant and humble, buffeted upon one cheek, I offered the other. I must live, I must have food. And you, Blanche, how often, to make me subservient to your will, have you said to me, you will do thus and so, if you desire to remain at Courtornieu. And I obeyed, I was forced to obey, since I knew not where to go. Ah! You have abused me in every way, but now my turn has come. Blanche was so amazed that she could not articulate a syllable. At last, in a scarcely audible voice, she faltered. I do not understand you, Aunt, I do not understand you. The poor dependent shrugged her shoulders, as her niece had done a few moments before. In that case, said she, slowly, I may as well tell you that since you have, against my will, made me your accomplice, we must share everything in common. I share the danger, I will share the pleasure. What if all should be discovered? Do you ever think of that? Yes, and that is why you are seeking diversion. Very well. I also desire diversion. I shall go to Paris with you. By a terrible effort Blanche had succeeded in regaining her self-possession, in some measure at least. And if I should say no, she responded, coldly. But you will not say no. And why, if you please? Because. Will you go to the authorities and denounce me? Aunt Medea shook her head. I am not such a fool, she retorted. I should only compromise myself. No, I shall not do that. But I might, perhaps, tell your husband what happened at the Borderie." Blanche shuddered. No threat was capable of moving her like that. "You shall accompany us, aunt," said she, "I promise it." Then she added, gently. "But it is unnecessary to threaten me. You have been cruel, aunt, and at the same time, unjust. If you have been unhappy in our house, you alone are to blame. Why have you said nothing? I attributed your complaisance to your affection for me. How was I to know that a woman as quiet and modest as yourself longed for fine apparel? Confess that it was impossible. Had I known, but rest easy, aunt, I will atone for my neglect." And as Aunt Medea, having obtained all she desired, stammered an excuse. "Nonsense!" Blanche exclaimed, "let us forget this foolish quarrel. You forgive me, do you not?" And the two ladies embraced each other with the greatest effusion, like two friends united after a misunderstanding. But Aunt Medea was as far from being deceived by this mock reconciliation as the clear-sighted Blanche. "It will be best for me to keep on the qui-vive," thought the humble relative. "God only knows with what intense joy my dear niece would send me to join Marianne." Perhaps a similar thought flitted through the mind of Madame Blanche. She felt as a convict might feel on seeing his most execrated enemy, perhaps the man who had betrayed him, fastened to the other end of his chain. "I am bound now and forever to this dangerous and perfidious creature," she thought. "I am no longer my own mistress, I belong to her. When she commands, I must obey. I must be the slave of her every caprice, and she has 40 years of humiliation and servitude to avenge." The prospect of such a life made her tremble. And she racked her brain to discover some way of freeing herself from her detested companion. Would it be possible to inspire Aunt Medea with a desire to live independently in her own house, served by her own servants? Might she succeed in persuading this silly old woman, who still longed for finery and ball dresses, to marry? A handsome marriage portion will always attract a husband. But, in either case, Blanche would require money, a large sum of money, for whose use she would be accountable to no one. This conviction made her resolve to take possession of about 250,000 francs, in banknotes and coin, belonging to her father. This sum represented the savings of the Marquis de Courtornieu during the past 3 years. No one knew he had laid it aside, except his daughter, and now that he had lost his reason, Blanche, who knew where the hoard was concealed, could take it for her own use without the slightest danger. With this, she thought, I can at any moment enrich Aunt Medea without having recourse to Martial. After this little scene there was a constant interchange of delicate attentions and touching devotion between the two ladies. It was, "My dearest little aunt," and "My dearly beloved niece," from morning until night, and the gossips of the neighborhood, who had often commented upon the haughty disdain which Madame Blanche displayed in her treatment of her relative, would have found abundant food for comment had they known that Aunt Medea was protected from the possibility of cold by a mantle lined with costly fur, exactly like the Marquise's own. And that she made the journey, not in the large berlin, with the servants, but in the post-chaise with the Marquis and Marquise de Sairmeuse. The change was so marked that even Martial remarked it, and as soon as he found himself alone with his wife, he exclaimed, in a tone of good-natured raillery, "What is the meaning of all this devotion? We shall finish by encasing this precious aunt in cotton, shall we not?" Blanche trembled, and flushed a little. "I love good Aunt Medea so much," said she. "I never can forget all the affection and devotion she lavished upon me when I was so unhappy." It was such a plausible explanation that Martial took no further notice of the matter, for his mind just then was fully occupied. The agent, whom he had sent to Paris in advance, to purchase, if possible, the Hôtel de Sairmeuse, had written him to make all possible haste, as there was some difficulty about concluding the bargain. "Plague take the fellow," said the Marquis, angrily, on receiving this news. "He is quite stupid enough to let this opportunity, for which we have been waiting 10 years, slip through his fingers. I shall find no pleasure in Paris if I cannot own our old residence." He was so impatient to reach Paris that, on the second day of their journey, he declared if he were alone he would travel all night. Do so now, said Blanche, graciously. I do not feel fatigued in the least, and a night of travel does not appall me. They did travel all night, and the next day, about 9 o'clock, they alighted at the Hotel Muris. Marshall scarcely took time to eat his breakfast. I must go and see my agent at once, he said, as he hurried off. I will soon be back. He reappeared in about 2 hours, pleased and radiant. My agent was a simpleton, he exclaimed. He was afraid to write me that a man, upon whom the conclusion of the sale depends, demands a bonus of 50,000 francs. He shall have it in welcome. Then, in a tone of gallantry, which he always used in addressing his wife, he said. It only remains for me to sign the paper, but I will not do so unless the house suits you. If you are not too tired, I would like you to visit it at once. Time presses, and we have many competitors. This visit was, of course, one of pure form, but Madame Blanche would have been hard to please if she had not been satisfied with this mansion, one of the most magnificent in Paris, with an entrance on the Rue de Grenelle, and large gardens shaded with superb trees, and extending to the Rue de Varennes. Unfortunately, this superb dwelling had not been occupied for several years, and required many repairs. It will take at least 6 months to restore it, said Marshall, perhaps more. It is true that they might in 3 months, perhaps, render a portion of it very comfortable. It would be living in one's own house, at least, approved Blanche, divining her husband's wishes. Ah! Then you agree with me. In that case, you may rest assured that I will expedite matters as much as possible. In spite, or rather by reason of his immense fortune, the Marquis de Sairmeuse knew that a person is never so well, nor so quickly served, as when he serves himself, so he resolved to take the matter into his own hands. He conferred with architects, interviewed contractors, and hurried on the workmen. As soon as he was up in the morning he started out without waiting for breakfast, and seldom returned until dinner. Although Blanche was compelled to pass most of her time within doors, on account of the bad weather, she was not inclined to complain. Her journey, the unaccustomed sights and sounds of Paris, the novelty of life in a hotel, all combined to distract her thoughts from herself. She forgot her fears, a sort of haze enveloped the terrible scene at the Borderie. The clamors of conscience sank into faint whispers. The past seemed fading away, and she was beginning to entertain hopes of a new and better life, when one day a servant entered, and said, "There is a man below who wishes to speak with Madame." Chapter 52. Half reclining upon a sofa, Madame Blanche was listening to a new book which Aunt Medea was reading aloud, and she did not even raise her head as the servant delivered his message. "A man?" she asked, carelessly, "what man?" She was expecting no one, it must be one of the laborers employed by Marshall. "I cannot inform Madame," replied the servant. "He is quite a young man, is dressed like a peasant, and is perhaps, seeking a place. It is probably the Marquis whom he desires to see. Madame will excuse me, but he said particularly that he desired to speak to her." "Ask his name and his business, then." "Go on, Aunt," she added. "We have been interrupted in the most interesting portion." But Aunt Medea had not time to finish the page when the servant reappeared. "The man says Madame will understand his business when she hears his name." "And his name?" "Chupin." It was as if a bombshell had exploded in the room. Aunt Medea, with a shriek, dropped her book, and sank back, half fainting, in her chair. Blanche sprang up with a face as colorless as her white cashmere peignoir, her eyes troubled, her lips trembling. "Chupin," she repeated, as if she hoped the servant would tell her she had not understood him correctly, "Chupin." Then angrily, "Tell this man that I will not see him, I will not see him, do you hear?" But before the servant had time to bow respectfully and retire, the young marquise changed her mind. "One moment," said she. "On reflection I think I will see him." "Bring him up." The servant withdrew, and the two ladies looked at each other in silent consternation. "It must be one of Chupin's sons," faltered Blanche, at last. "Undoubtedly, but what does he desire?" Money, probably. Aunt Medea lifted her eyes to heaven. God grant that he knows nothing of your meetings with his father. Blessed Jesus! What if he should know? You are not going to despair in advance. We shall know all in a few moments. Pray be calm. Turn your back to us, look out into the street, do not let him see your face. But why is he so long in coming? Blanche was not deceived. It was Chupin's eldest son, the one to whom the dying poacher had confided his secret. Since his arrival in Paris he had been running the streets from morning until evening, inquiring everywhere and of everybody the address of the Marquis de Sermuz. At last he discovered it. And he lost no time in presenting himself at the Hôtel Muris. He was now awaiting the result of his application at the entrance of the hotel, where he stood whistling, with his hands in his pockets, when the servant returned, saying, "She consents to see you, follow me." Chupin obeyed. But the servant, greatly astonished, and on fire with curiosity, loitered by the way in the hope of obtaining some explanation from this country youth. "I do not say it to flatter you, my boy," he remarked, "but your name produced a great effect upon Madame." The prudent peasant carefully concealed the joy he felt on receiving this information. "How does it happen that she knows you?" pursued the servant. "Are you both from the same place?" "I am her foster brother." The servant did not believe a word of this response, but they had reached the apartment of the Marquise. He opened the door and ushered Chupin into the room. The peasant had prepared a little story in advance, but he was so dazzled by the magnificence around him that he stood motionless with staring eyes and gaping mouth. His wonder was increased by a large mirror opposite the door, in which he could survey himself from head to foot, and by the beautiful flowers on the carpet, which he feared to crush beneath his heavy shoes. After a moment, Madame Blanche decided to break the silence. "What do you wish?" she demanded. With many circumlocutions Chupin explained that he had been obliged to leave Sermuz on account of the numerous enemies he had there, that he had been unable to find his father's hidden treasure, and that he was consequently without resources. "Enough," interrupted Madame Blanche. Then in a manner not in the least friendly, she continued, "I do not understand why you should apply to me. You and all the rest of your family have anything but an enviable reputation in Sermuz. Still, as you are from that part of the country, I am willing to aid you a little on condition that you do not apply to me again." Chupin listened to this homily with a half-cringing, half-impudent air. When it was finished he lifted his head, and said, proudly, "I do not ask for alms." "What do you ask then?" "My dues." The heart of Madame Blanche sank, and yet she had courage to cast a glance of disdain upon the speaker, and said, "Ah! Do I owe you anything?" "You owe me nothing personally, madam, but you owe a heavy debt to my deceased father." "In whose service did he perish?" "Poor old man! He loved you devotedly. His last words were of you." "A terrible thing has just happened at the Borderie, my boy," said he. "The young Marquise hated Marie-Anne, and she has poisoned her. Had it not been for me she would have been lost. I am about to die, let the whole blame rest upon me. It will not hurt me, and it will save the young lady. And afterward she will reward you, and as long as you keep the secret you will want for nothing." Great as was his impudence, he paused, amazed by the perfectly composed face of the listener. In the presence of such wonderful dissimulation he almost doubted the truth of his father's story. The courage and heroism displayed by the Marquise were really wonderful. She felt if she yielded once, she would forever be at the mercy of this wretch, as she was already at the mercy of Aunt Medea. "In other words," said she, calmly, "you accuse me of the murder of Mademoiselle Lacheneur. And you threaten to denounce me if I do not yield to your demands." Chupin nodded his head in acquiescence. "Very well," said the Marquise, "since this is the case, go." It seemed, indeed, as if she would, by her audacity, win this dangerous game upon which her future peace depended. Chupin, greatly abashed, was standing there undecided what course to pursue when Aunt Medea, who was listening by the window, turned in affright, crying, Blanche. Your husband, Marshall. He is coming. The game was lost. Blanche saw her husband entering, finding Chupin, conversing with him, and discovering all. Her brain whirled, she yielded. She hastily thrust her purse in Chupin's hand and dragged him through an inner door and to the servants' staircase. Take this, she said, in a hoarse whisper. I will see you again. And not a word to my husband, remember. She had been wise to yield in time. When she re-entered the salon, she found Marshall there. His head was bowed upon his breast, he held an open letter in his hand. He looked up when his wife entered the room, and she saw a tear in his eye. What has happened? She faltered. Marshall did not remark her emotion. My father is dead, Blanche, he replied. The Duc de Sermeuse. My God! How did it happen? He was thrown from his horse, in the forest, near the Sanguille rocks. Ah! It was there where my poor father was nearly murdered. Yes, it is the very place. There was a moment's silence. Marshall's affection for his father had not been very deep, and he was well aware that his father had but little love for him. He was astonished at the bitter grief he felt on hearing of his death. From this letter, which was forwarded by a messenger from Sermeuse, he continued, I judge that everybody believes it to have been an accident, but well, I believe he was murdered. An exclamation of horror escaped Aunt Medea, and Blanche turned pale. Murdered, she whispered. Yes, Blanche, and I could name the murderer. Oh! I am not deceived. The murderer of my father is the same man who attempted to assassinate the Marquis de Courtornieu. Jean Lacheneur. Marshall gravely bowed his head. It was his only reply. And you will not denounce him? You will not demand justice? Marshall's face grew more and more gloomy. What good would it do, he replied. I have no material proofs to give, and justice demands incontestable evidence. Then, as if communing with his own thoughts, rather than addressing his wife, he said, despondently. The Duc de Sermeuse and the Marquis de Courtornieu have reaped what they have sown. The blood of murdered innocents always calls for vengeance. Sooner or later, the guilty must expiate their crimes. Blanche shuddered. Each word found an echo in her own soul. Had he intended his words for her, he would not have expressed himself differently. Marshall, said she, trying to arouse him from his gloomy reverie, Marshall. He did not seem to hear her, and, in the same tone, he continued. These Lacheneurs were happy and honored before our arrival at Sermeuse. Their conduct was above all praise, their probity amounted to heroism. We might have made them our faithful and devoted friends. It was our duty, as well as in our interests, to have done so. We did not understand this. We humiliated, ruined, exasperated them. It was a fault for which we must atone. Who knows but, in Jean Lacheneur's place, I should have done what he has done. He was silent for a moment. Then, with one of those sudden inspirations that sometimes enable one almost to read the future, he resumed. I know Jean Lacheneur. I alone can fathom his hatred, and I know that he lives only in the hope of vengeance. It is true that we are very high and he is very low, but that matters little. We have everything to fear. Our millions form a rampart around us, but he will know how to open a breach. And no precautions will save us. At the very moment when we feel ourselves secure, he will be ready to strike. What he will attempt, I know not, but his will be a terrible revenge. Remember my words, Blanche, if ruin ever threatens our house, it will be Jean Lacheneur's work. Aunt Medea and her niece were too horror-stricken to articulate a word, and for 5 minutes no sound broke the stillness save Marshall's monotonous tread, as he paced up and down the room. At last he paused before his wife. I have just ordered post-horses. You will excuse me for leaving you here alone. I must go to Sermeuse at once. I shall not be absent more than a week. He departed from Paris a few hours later, and Blanche was left a prey to the most intolerable anxiety. She suffered more now than during the days that immediately followed her crime. It was not against phantoms she was obliged to protect herself now. Chupin existed, and his voice, even if it were not as terrible as the voice of conscience, might make itself heard at any moment. If she had known where to find him, she would have gone to him, and endeavored, by the payment of a large sum of money, to persuade him to leave France. But Chupin had left the hotel without giving her his address. The gloomy apprehension expressed by Martial increased the fears of the young marquise. The mere sound of the name Lacheneur made her shrink with terror. She could not rid herself of the idea that Jean Lacheneur suspected her guilt, and that he was watching her. Her wish to find Marie-Anne's infant was stronger than ever. It seemed to her that the child might be a protection to her some day. But where could she find an agent in whom she could confide? At last she remembered that she had heard her father speak of a detective by the name of Chelteuse, an exceedingly shrewd fellow, capable of anything, even honesty if he were well paid. The man was really a miserable wretch, one of Fouché's vilest instruments, who had served and betrayed all parties, and who, at last, had been convicted of perjury, but had somehow managed to escape punishment. After his dismissal from the police force, Chelteuse founded a bureau of private information. After several inquiries, Madame Blanche discovered that he lived in the Place Dauphine. And she determined to take advantage of her husband's absence to pay the detective a visit. One morning she donned her simplest dress, and, accompanied by Aunt Medea, repaired to the house of Chelteuse. He was then, about 34 years of age, a man of medium height, of inoffensive mien, and who affected an unvarying good humor. He invited his clients into a nicely furnished drawing-room, and Madame Blanche at once began telling him that she was married, and living in the Rue Saint-Denis, that one of her sisters, who had lately died, had been guilty of an indiscretion, and that she was ready to make any sacrifice to find this sister's child. Etc. Etc. A long story, which she had prepared in advance, and which sounded very plausible. Chelteuse did not believe a word of it, however. For, as soon as it was ended, he tapped her familiarly on the shoulder, and said, "In short, my dear, we have had our little escapades before our marriage." She shrank back as if from some venomous reptile. To be treated thus. She, a Courtornieu, Duchesse de Sairmeuse. "I think you are laboring under a wrong impression," she said, haughtily. He made haste to apologize, but while listening to further details given him by the young lady, he thought, "What an eye! What a voice! They are not suited to a denizen of the Saint-Denis." His suspicions were confirmed by the reward of 20,000 francs, which Madame Blanche imprudently promised him in case of success, and by the 500 francs which she paid in advance. "And where shall I have the honor of addressing my communications to you, madam?" he inquired. "Nowhere," replied the young lady. "I shall be passing here from time to time, and I will call." When they left the house, Chelteuse followed them. For once, he thought, I believe that fortune smiles upon me. To discover the name and rank of his new clients was but child's play to Fouché's former pupil. His task was all the easier since they had no suspicion whatever of his designs. Madame Blanche, who had heard his powers of discernment so highly praised, was confident of success. All the way back to the hotel she was congratulating herself upon the step she had taken. In less than a month, she said to Aunt Medea, "We shall have the child, and it will be a protection to us." But the following week she realized the extent of her imprudence. On visiting Chelteuse again, she was received with such marks of respect that she saw at once she was known. She made an attempt to deceive him, but the detective checked her. "First of all," he said, with a good-humored smile, "I ascertain the identity of the persons who honor me with their confidence. It is a proof of my ability, which I give, gratis. But Madame need have no fears. I am discreet by nature and by profession. Many ladies of the highest ranks are in the position of Madame la Duchesse." So Chelteuse still believed that the Duchesse de Sairmeuse was searching for her own child. She did not try to convince him to the contrary. It was better that he should believe this than suspect the truth. The condition of Madame Blanche was now truly pitiable. She found herself entangled in a net, and each movement far from freeing her, tightened the meshes around her. 3 persons knew the secret that threatened her life and honor. Under these circumstances, how could she hope to keep that secret inviolate? She was, moreover, at the mercy of 3 unscrupulous masters. And before a word, or a gesture, or a look from them, her haughty spirit was compelled to bow in meek subservience. And her time was no longer at her own disposal. Martial had returned, and they had taken up their abode at the Hôtel de Sairmeuse. The young Duchess was now compelled to live under the scrutiny of 50 servants, of 50 enemies, more or less, interested in watching her, in criticizing her every act, and in discovering her inmost thoughts. Aunt Medea, it is true, was of great assistance to her. Blanche purchased a dress for her, whenever she purchased one for herself, took her about with her on all occasions, and the humble relative expressed her satisfaction in the most enthusiastic terms. And declared her willingness to do anything for her benefactress. Nor did Chelteus give Madame Blanche much more annoyance. Every 3 months he presented a memorandum of the expenses of investigations, which usually amounted to about 10,000 francs. And so long as she paid him it was plain that he would be silent. He had given her to understand, however, that he should expect an annuity of 24,000 francs, and once, when Madame Blanche remarked that he must abandon the search, if nothing had been discovered at the end of 2 years. Never, he replied, I shall continue the search as long as I live. But Chupin, unfortunately, remained, and he was a constant terror. She had been compelled to give him 20,000 francs, to begin with. He declared that his younger brother had come to Paris in pursuit of him, accusing him of having stolen their father's hoard, and demanding his share with his dagger in his hand. There had been a battle, and it was with a head bound up in a blood-stained linen, that Chupin made his appearance before Madame Blanche. Give me the sum that the old man buried, and I will allow my brother to think that I had stolen it. It is not very pleasant to be regarded as a thief, when one is an honest man, but I will bear it for your sake. If you refuse, I shall be compelled to tell him where I have obtained my money and how. If he possessed all the vices, depravity, and cold-blooded perversity of his father, this wretch had inherited neither his intelligence nor his finesse. Instead of taking the precautions which his interest required, he seemed to find a brutal pleasure in compromising the Duchess. He was a constant visitor at the Hôtel de Sairmeuse. He came and went at all hours, morning, noon, and night, without troubling himself in the least about Martial. And the servants were amazed to see their haughty mistress unhesitatingly leave everything at the call of this suspicious-looking character, who smelled so strongly of tobacco and vile brandy. One evening, while a grand entertainment was in progress at the Hôtel de Sairmeuse, he made his appearance, half drunk, and imperiously ordered the servants to go and tell Madame Blanche that he was there, and that he was waiting for her. She hastened to him in her magnificent evening dress, her face white with rage and shame beneath her tiara of diamonds. And when, in her exasperation, she refused to give the wretch what he demanded. That is to say, I am to starve while you are reveling here, he exclaimed. I am not such a fool. Give me money, and instantly, or I will tell all I know here and now. What could she do? She was obliged to yield, as she had always done before. And yet he grew more and more insatiable every day. Money remained in his pockets no longer than water remains in a sieve. But he did not think of elevating his vices to the proportions of the fortune which he squandered. He did not even provide himself with decent clothing. From his appearance one would have supposed him a beggar, and his companions were the vilest and most degraded of beings. One night he was arrested in a low den, and the police, surprised at seeing so much gold in the possession of such a beggarly-looking wretch, accused him of being a thief. He mentioned the name of the Duchesse de Sairmeuse. An inspector of the police presented himself at the Hôtel de Sairmeuse the following morning. Martial, fortunately, was in Vienna at the time. And Madame Blanche was forced to undergo the terrible humiliation of confessing that she had given a large sum of money to this man, whose family she had known, and who, she added, had once rendered her an important service. Sometimes her tormentor changed his tactics. For example, he declared that he disliked to come to the Hôtel de Sairmeuse, that the servants treated him as if he were a mendicant, that after this he would write. And in a day or two there would come a letter bidding her bring such a sum, to such a place, at such an hour. And the proud Duchess was always punctual at the rendezvous. There was constantly some new invention, as if he found an intense delight in proving his power and in abusing it. He had met, heaven knows where, a certain Aspasie Clapard, to whom he took a violent fancy, and although she was much older than himself, he wished to marry her. Madame Blanche paid for the wedding feast. Again he announced his desire of establishing himself in business, having resolved, he said, to live by his own exertions. He purchased the stock of a wine merchant, which the Duchess paid for, and which he drank in no time. His wife gave birth to a child, and Madame de Sairmeuse must pay for the baptism as she had paid for the wedding, only too happy that Chupin did not require her to stand as godmother to little Pauline. He had entertained this idea at first. On 2 occasions Madame Blanche accompanied her husband to Vienna and to London, whither he went charged with important diplomatic missions. She remained 3 years in foreign lands. Each week during all that time she received 1 letter, at least, from Chupin. Ah! Many a time she envied the lot of her victim. What was Marie-Anne's death compared with the life she led? Her sufferings were measured by years, Marie-Anne's by minutes, and she said to herself, again and again, that the torture of poison could not be as intolerable as her agony. Chapter 53. How was it that Martial had failed to discover or to suspect this state of affairs? A moment's reflection will explain this fact which is so extraordinary in appearance, so natural in reality. The head of a family, whether he dwells in an attic or in a palace, is always the last to know what is going on in his home. What everybody else knows he does not even suspect. The master often sleeps while his house is on fire. Some terrible catastrophe, an explosion, is necessary to arouse him from his fancied security. The life that Martial led was likely to prevent him from arriving at the truth. He was a stranger to his wife. His manner toward her was perfect, full of deference and chivalrous courtesy, but they had nothing in common except a name and certain interests. Each lived their own life. They met only at dinner, or at the entertainments which they gave and which were considered the most brilliant in Paris society. The Duchess had her own apartments, her servants, her carriages, her horses, her own table. At 25, Martial, the last descendant of the great house of Sairmeuse, a man upon whom destiny had apparently lavished every blessing, the possessor of youth, unbounded wealth, and a brilliant intellect, succumbed beneath the burden of an incurable despondency and ennui. The death of Marie-Anne had destroyed all his hopes of happiness, and realizing the emptiness of his life, he did his best to fill the void with bustle and excitement. He threw himself headlong into politics, striving to find in power and in satisfied ambition some relief from his despondency. It is only just to say that Madame Blanche had remained superior to circumstances, and that she had played the role of a happy, contented woman with consummate skill. Her frightful sufferings and anxiety never marred the haughty serenity of her face. She soon won a place as one of the queens of Parisian society, and plunged into dissipation with a sort of frenzy. Was she endeavoring to divert her mind? Did she hope to overpower thought by excessive fatigue? To Aunt Medea alone did Blanche reveal her secret heart. I am like a culprit who has been bound to the scaffold, and then abandoned by the executioner, who says, as he departs, live until the axe falls of its own accord. And the axe might fall at any moment. A word, a trifle, an unlucky chance, she dared not say, a decree of Providence, and Martial would know all. Such, in all its unspeakable horror, was the position of the beautiful and envied Duchesse de Sairmeuse. She must be perfectly happy, said the world, but she felt herself sliding down the precipice to the awful depths below. Like a shipwrecked mariner clinging to a floating spar, she scanned the horizon with a despairing eye, and saw only angry and threatening clouds. Time, perhaps, might bring her some relief. Once it happened that 6 weeks went by, and she heard nothing from Chupin. A month and a half. What had become of him? To Madame Blanche this silence was as ominous as the calm that precedes the storm. A line in a newspaper solved the mystery. Chupin was in prison. The wretch, after drinking more heavily than usual one evening, had quarrelled with his brother, and had killed him by a blow upon the head with a piece of iron. The blood of the betrayed Lacheneur was visited upon the heads of his murderer's children. Tried by the Court of Assizes, Chupin was condemned to 20 years of hard labor, and sent to Brest. But this sentence afforded the Duchess no relief. The culprit had written to her from his Paris prison, he wrote to her from Brest. But he did not send his letters through the post. He confided them to comrades, whose terms of imprisonment had expired, and who came to the Hôtel de Sermeuse demanding an interview with the Duchess. And she received them. They told all the miseries they had endured out there. And usually ended by requesting some slight assistance. One morning, a man whose desperate appearance and manner frightened her, brought the Duchess this laconic epistle. "I am tired of starving here, I wish to make my escape. Come to Brest. You can visit the prison, and we will decide upon some plan. If you refuse to do this, I shall apply to the Duke, who will obtain my pardon in exchange of what I will tell him." Madame Blanche was dumb with horror. It was impossible, she thought, to sink lower than this. "Well," demanded the man, harshly. "What reply shall I make to my comrade?" "I will go, tell him that I will go," she said, driven to desperation. She made the journey, visited the prison, but did not find Chupin. The previous week there had been a revolt in the prison, the troops had fired upon the prisoners, and Chupin had been killed instantly. Still the Duchess dared not rejoice. She feared that her tormentor had told his wife the secret of his power. "I shall soon know," she thought. The widow promptly made her appearance, but her manner was humble and supplicating. She had often heard her dead husband say that Madame was his benefactress, and now she came to beg a little aid to enable her to open a small drinking saloon. Her son Polyte, such a good son. Just 18 years old, and such a help to his poor mother, had discovered a little house in a good situation for the business, and if they only had 300 or 400 francs. Madame Blanche gave her 500 francs. Either her humility is a mask, she thought, or her husband has told her nothing. 5 days later Polyte Chupin presented himself. They needed 300 francs more before they could commence business, and he came on behalf of his mother to entreat the kind lady to advance them. Determined to discover exactly where she stood, the Duchess shortly refused, and the young man departed without a word. Evidently the mother and son were ignorant of the facts. Chupin's secret had died with him. This happened early in January. Toward the last of February, Aunt Medea contracted inflammation of the lungs on leaving a fancy ball, which she attended in an absurd costume, in spite of all the attempts which her niece made to dissuade her. Her passion for dress killed her. Her illness lasted only 3 days, but her sufferings, physical and mental, were terrible. Constrained by her fear of death to examine her own conscience, she saw plainly that by profiting by the crime of her niece she had been as culpable as if she had aided her in committing it. She had been very devout in former years, and now her superstitious fears were reawakened and intensified. Her faith returned, accompanied by a cortege of terrors. "I am lost," she cried, "I am lost." She tossed to and fro upon her bed. She writhed and shrieked as if she already saw hell opening to engulf her. She called upon the Holy Virgin and upon all the saints to protect her. She entreated God to grant her time for repentance and for expiation. She begged to see a priest, swearing she would make a full confession. Paler than the dying woman, but implacable, Blanche watched over her, aided by that one of her personal attendants in whom she had most confidence. If this lasts long, I shall be ruined, she thought. I shall be obliged to call for assistance, and she will betray me. It did not last long. The patient's delirium was succeeded by such utter prostration that it seemed each moment would be her last. But toward midnight she appeared to revive a little, and in a voice of intense feeling, she said, "You have had no pity, Blanche. You have deprived me of all hope in the life to come. God will punish you. You, too, shall die like a dog, alone, without a word of Christian counsel or encouragement. I curse you." And she died just as the clock was striking 2. The time when Blanche would have given almost anything to know that Aunt Medea was beneath the sod, had long since passed. Now, the death of the poor old woman affected her deeply. She had lost an accomplice who had often consoled her, and she had gained nothing, since one of her maids was now acquainted with the secret of the crime at the Borderie. Everyone who was intimately acquainted with the Duchesse de Sairmeuse noticed her dejection, and was astonished by it. "Is it not strange," remarked her friends, "that the Duchess, such a very superior woman, should grieve so much for that absurd relative of hers?" But the dejection of Madame Blanche was due in great measure to the sinister prophecies of the accomplice to whom she had denied the last consolations of religion. And as her mind reviewed the past she shuddered, as the peasants at Sairmeuse had done, when she thought of the fatality which had pursued the shedders of innocent blood. What misfortune had attended them all, from the sons of Chupin, the miserable traitor, up to her father, the Marquis de Courtornieu, whose mind had not been illumined by the least gleam of reason for 10 long years before his death. "My turn will come," she thought. The Baron and the Baroness d'Escorval, and old Corporal Bavois had departed this life within a month of each other, the previous year, mourned by all. So that of all the people of diverse condition who had been connected with the troubles at Montaignac, Blanche knew only 4 who were still alive. Maurice d'Escorval, who had entered the magistracy, and was now a judge in the tribunal of the Seine, Abbé Midden, who had come to Paris with Maurice, and Marshall and herself. There was another person, the bare recollection of whom made her tremble, and whose name she dared not utter. Jean Lacheneur, Marie-Anne's brother. An inward voice, more powerful than reason, told her that this implacable enemy was still alive, watching for his hour of vengeance. More troubled by her presentiments now, than she had been by Chupin's persecutions in days gone by, Madame de Sairmeuse decided to apply to Chelteuse in order to ascertain, if possible, what she had to expect. Fouché's former agent had not wavered in his devotion to the Duchess. Every 3 months he presented his bill, which was paid without discussion. And to ease his conscience, he sent one of his men to prowl around Sairmeuse for a while, at least once a year. Animated by the hope of a magnificent reward, the spy promised his client, and, what was more to the purpose, promised himself, that he would discover this dreaded enemy. He started in quest of him, and had already begun to collect proofs of Jean's existence, when his investigations were abruptly terminated. One morning the body of a man literally hacked in pieces was found in an old well. It was the body of Chelteuse. "A fitting close to the career of such a wretch," said the Journal de Débats, in noting the event. When she read this news, Madame Blanche felt as a culprit would feel on reading his death warrant. "The end is near," she murmured. "Lacheneur is coming." The Duchess was not mistaken. Jean had told the truth when he declared that he was not disposing of his sister's estate for his own benefit. In his opinion, Marie-Anne's fortune must be consecrated to one sacred purpose. He would not divert the slightest portion of it to his individual needs. He was absolutely penniless when the manager of a traveling theatrical company engaged him for a consideration of 45 francs per month. From that day he lived the precarious life of a strolling player. He was poorly paid, and often reduced to abject poverty by lack of engagements, or by the impecuniosity of managers. His hatred had lost none of its virulence. But to wreak the desired vengeance upon his enemy, he must have time and money at his disposal. But how could he accumulate money when he was often too poor to appease his hunger? Still he did not renounce his hopes. His was a rancor which was only intensified by years. He was biding his time while he watched from the depths of his misery the brilliant fortunes of the house of Sairmeuse. He had waited 16 years, when one of his friends procured him an engagement in Russia. The engagement was nothing. But the poor comedian was afterward fortunate enough to obtain an interest in a theatrical enterprise, from which he realized a fortune of 100,000 francs in less than 6 years. "Now," said he, "I can give up this life. I am rich enough, now, to begin the warfare." And 6 weeks later he arrived in his native village. Before carrying any of his atrocious designs into execution, he went to Sairmeuse to visit Marie-Anne's grave, in order to obtain there an increase of animosity, as well as the relentless sang-froid of a stern avenger of crime. That was his only motive in going, but, on the very evening of his arrival, he learned through a garrulous old peasant woman that ever since his departure, that is to say, for a period of 20 years, 2 parties had been making persistent inquiries for a child which had been placed somewhere in the neighborhood. Jean knew that it was Marie-Anne's child they were seeking. Why they had not succeeded in finding it, he knew equally well. But why were there 2 persons seeking the child? One was Maurice d'Escorval, of course, but who was the other? Instead of remaining at Sairmeuse a week, Jean Lacheneur tarried there a month, and by the expiration of that month he had traced these inquiries concerning the child to the agent of Chelteuse. Through him, he reached Fouché's former spy. And, finally, succeeded in discovering that the search had been instituted by no less a person than the Duchesse de Sairmeuse. This discovery bewildered him. How could Madame Blanche have known that Marie-Anne had given birth to a child? And knowing it, what possible interest could she have had in finding it? These 2 questions tormented Jean's mind continually, but he could discover no satisfactory answer. Chupin's son could tell me, perhaps, he thought. I must pretend to be reconciled to the sons of the wretch who betrayed my father. But the traitor's children had been dead for several years, and after a long search, Jean found only the widow Chupin and her son, Paulet. They were keeping a drinking saloon not far from the Château de Rentiers, and their establishment, known as the Poivrière, bore anything but an enviable reputation. Lacheneur questioned the widow and her son in vain. They could give him no information whatever on the subject. He told them his name, but even this did not awaken the slightest recollection in their minds. Jean was about to take his departure when Mother Chupin, probably in the hope of extracting a few pennies, began to deplore her present misery, which was, she declared, all the harder to bear since she had wanted for nothing during the life of her poor husband, who had always obtained as much money as he wanted from a lady of high degree, the Duchesse de Sairmeuse, in short. Lacheneur uttered such a terrible oath that the old woman and her son started back in a fright. He saw at once the close connection between the researches of Madame Blanche and her generosity to Chupin. It was she who poisoned Marie-Anne, he said to himself. It was through my sister that she became aware of the existence of the child. She loaded Chupin with favors because he knew the crime she had committed, that crime in which his father had been only an accomplice. He remembered Martial's oath at the bedside of the murdered girl, and his heart overflowed with savage exultation. He saw his 2 enemies, the last of the Sairmeuse and the last of the Courtornieu, take in their own hands his work of vengeance. But this was mere conjecture. He desired to be assured of the correctness of his suppositions. He drew from his pocket a handful of gold, and, throwing it upon the table, he said, I am very rich. If you will obey me and keep my secret, your fortune is made. A shrill cry of delight from mother and son outweighed any protestations of obedience. The widow Chupin knew how to write, and Lacheneur dictated this letter. Madame la Duchesse, I shall expect you at my establishment. Tomorrow between 12 and 4 o'clock. It is on business. Connected with the Borderie. If at 5 o'clock I have not seen you, I shall carry to the post a letter for the Duke. And if she comes, what am I to say to her? Asked the astonished widow. Nothing, you will merely ask her for money. If she comes, it is as I have guessed, he reflected. She came. Hidden in the loft of the Poivrière, Jean, through an opening in the floor, saw the Duchess give a banknote to Mother Chupin. Now, she is in my power, he thought exultantly. Through what sloughs of degradation will I drag her before I deliver her up to her husband's vengeance? Chapter 54. A few lines of the article consecrated to Marshal de Sairmeuse in the General Biography of the Men of the Century give the history of his life after his marriage. Marshal de Sairmeuse, it says there, brought to the service of his party a brilliant intellect and admirable endowments. Called to the front at the moment when political strife was raging with the utmost violence, he had courage to assume the sole responsibility of the most extreme measures. Compelled by almost universal opprobrium to retire from office, he left behind him animosities which will be extinguished only with life. But what this article does not state is this: if Marshal was wrong, and that depends entirely upon the point of view from which his conduct is regarded, he was doubly wrong. Since he was not possessed of those ardent convictions verging upon fanaticism which make men fools, heroes, and martyrs. He was not even ambitious. Those associated with him, witnessing his passionate struggle and his unceasing activity, thought him actuated by an insatiable thirst for power. He cared little or nothing for it. He considered its burdens heavy, its compensation small. His pride was too lofty to feel any satisfaction in the applause that delights the vain, and flattery disgusted him. Often, in his princely drawing-rooms, during some brilliant fete, his acquaintances noticed a shade of gloom steal over his features, and seeing him thus thoughtful and preoccupied, they respectfully refrained from disturbing him. His mind is occupied with momentous questions, they thought. Who can tell what important decisions may result from this reverie? They were mistaken. At the very moment when his brilliant success made his rivals pale with envy, when it would seem that he had nothing left to wish for in this world, Marshal was saying to himself, "What an empty life! What weariness and vexation of spirit! To live for others, what a mockery!" He looked at his wife, radiant in her beauty, worshipped like a queen, and he sighed. He thought of her who was dead, Marie-Anne, the only woman whom he had ever loved. She was never absent from his mind. After all these years he saw her yet, cold, rigid, lifeless, in that luxurious room at the Borderie. And time, far from effacing the image of the fair girl who had won his youthful heart, made it still more radiant and endowed his lost idol with almost superhuman grace of person and of character. If fate had but given him Marie-Anne for his wife! He said this to himself again and again, picturing the exquisite happiness which a life with her would have afforded him. They would have remained at Sairmeuse. They would have had lovely children playing around them. He would not be condemned to this continual warfare, to this hollow, unsatisfying, restless life. The truly happy are not those who parade their satisfaction and good fortune before the eyes of the multitude. The truly happy hide themselves from the curious gaze, and they are right, happiness is almost a crime. So thought Marshal, and he, the great statesman, often said to himself, in a sort of rage, "To love, and to be loved, that is everything. All else is vanity." He had really tried to love his wife, he had done his best to rekindle the admiration with which she had inspired him at their first meeting. He had not succeeded. Between them there seemed to be a wall of ice which nothing could melt, and which was constantly increasing in height and thickness. Why is it, he wondered, again and again. It is incomprehensible. There are days when I could swear that she loved me. Her character, formerly so irritable, is entirely changed, she is gentleness itself. But he could not conquer his aversion, it was stronger than his own will. These unavailing regrets, and the disappointments and sorrow that preyed upon him, undoubtedly aggravated the bitterness and severity of Marshall's policy. But he, at least, knew how to fall nobly. He passed, without even a change of countenance, from almost omnipotence to a position so compromising that his very life was endangered. On seeing his antechambers, formerly thronged with flatterers and office-seekers, empty and deserted, he laughed, and his laugh was unaffected. "The ship is sinking," said he, "the rats have deserted it." He did not even pale when the noisy crowd came to hoot and curse and hurl stones at his windows, and when Otto, his faithful valet de chambre, entreated him to assume a disguise and make his escape through the gardens, he responded, "By no means. I am simply odious, I do not wish to become ridiculous." They could not even dissuade him from going to a window and looking down upon the rabble in the street below. A singular idea had just occurred to him. If Jean Lacheneur is still alive, he thought, how much he would enjoy this. And if he is alive, he is undoubtedly there in the foremost rank, urging on the crowd. And he wished to see. But Jean Lacheneur was in Russia at that epoch. The excitement subsided, the Hôtel de Sermuse was not seriously threatened. Still Marshall realized that it would be better for him to go away for a while, and allow people to forget him. He did not ask the Duchess to accompany him. "The fault has been mine entirely," he said to her, "and to make you suffer for it by condemning you to exile would be unjust. Remain here, I think it will be much better for you to remain here." She did not offer to go with him. It would have been a pleasure to her, but she dared not leave Paris. She knew that she must remain in order to ensure the silence of her persecutors. Both times she had left Paris before, all came near being discovered, and yet she had Aunt Medea, then, to take her place. Marshall went away, accompanied only by his devoted servant, Otto. In intelligence, this man was decidedly superior to his position, he possessed an independent fortune, and he had 100 reasons, one, by the way, was a very pretty one, for desiring to remain in Paris. But his master was in trouble, and he did not hesitate. For 4 years the Duc de Sermuse wandered over Europe, ever accompanied by his ennui and his dejection, and chafing beneath the burden of a life no longer animated by interest or sustained by hope. He remained a while in London, then he went to Vienna, afterward to Venice. One day he was seized by an irresistible desire to see Paris again, and he returned. It was not a very prudent step, perhaps. His bitterest enemies, personal enemies, whom he had mortally offended and persecuted, were in power, but he did not hesitate. Besides, how could they injure him, since he had no favors to ask, no cravings of ambition to satisfy? The exile which had weighed so heavily upon him, the sorrow, the disappointments and loneliness he had endured had softened his nature and inclined his heart to tenderness. And he returned firmly resolved to overcome his aversion to his wife, and seek a reconciliation. Old age is approaching, he thought. If I have not a beloved wife at my fireside, I may at least have a friend. His manner toward her, on his return, astonished Madame Blanche. She almost believed she saw again the Marshal of the little blue salon at Courtornieu, but the realization of her cherished dream was now only another torture added to all the others. Marshall was striving to carry his plan into execution, when the following laconic epistle came to him one day through the post. Monsieur le Duc, I, if I were in your place, would watch my wife. It was only an anonymous letter, but Marshall's blood mounted to his forehead. Can it be that she has a lover, he thought. Then reflecting on his own conduct toward his wife since their marriage, he said to himself. And if she has, have I any right to complain? Did I not tacitly give her back her liberty? He was greatly troubled, and yet he would not have degraded himself so much as to play the spy, had it not been for one of those trifling circumstances which so often decide a man's destiny. He was returning from a ride on horseback one morning about 11 o'clock, and he was not 30 paces from the Hôtel de Sermuse when he saw a lady hurriedly emerge from the house. She was very plainly dressed, entirely in black, but her whole appearance was strikingly that of the Duchess. It is certainly my wife, but why is she dressed in such a fashion, he thought. Had he been on foot he would certainly have entered the house. As it was, he slowly followed Madame Blanche, who was going up the Rue Crenelle. She walked very quickly, and without turning her head, and kept her face persistently shrouded in a very thick veil. When she reached the Rue Taranne, she threw herself into one of the fiacres at the carriage stand. The coachman came to the door to speak to her, then nimbly sprang upon the box, and gave his bony horses one of those cuts of the whip that announce a princely pourboire. The carriage had already turned the corner of the Rue du Dragon, and Marshall, ashamed and irresolute, had not moved from the place where he had stopped his horse, just around the corner of the Rue Saint-Pères. Not daring to admit his suspicions, he tried to deceive himself. Nonsense, he thought, giving the reins to his horse, what do I risk in advancing? The carriage is a long way off by this time, and I shall not overtake it. He did overtake it, however, on reaching the intersection of the Croix Rouge, where there was, as usual, a crowd of vehicles. It was the same fiacre. Marshall recognized it by its green body, and its wheels striped with white. Emerging from the crowd of carriages, the driver whipped up his horses, and it was at a gallop that they flew up the Rue du Vieux Colombier, the narrowest street that borders the Place Saint-Sulpice, and gained the outer boulevards. Marshall's thoughts were busy as he trotted along about 100 yards behind the vehicle. She is in a terrible hurry, he said to himself. This, however, is scarcely the quarter for a lover's rendezvous. The carriage had passed the Place d'Italie. It entered the Rue du Château de Rentiers and soon paused before a tract of unoccupied ground. The door was at once opened, and the Duchesse de Sairmeuse hastily alighted. Without stopping to look to the right or to the left, she hurried across the open space. A man, by no means prepossessing in appearance, with a long beard, and with a pipe in his mouth, and clad in a workman's blouse, was seated upon a large block of stone not far off. "Will you hold my horse a moment?" inquired Marshall. "Certainly," answered the man. Had Marshall been less preoccupied, his suspicions might have been aroused by the malicious smile that curved the man's lips, and had he examined his features closely, he would perhaps have recognized him. For it was Jean Lacheneur. Since addressing that anonymous letter to the Duc de Sairmeuse, he had made the Duchess multiply her visits to the widow Chupin, and each time he had watched for her coming. So, if her husband decides to follow her I shall know it, he thought. It was indispensable for the success of his plans that Madame Blanche should be watched by her husband. For Jean Lacheneur had decided upon his course. From 1,000 schemes for revenge he had chosen the most frightful and ignoble that a brain maddened and enfevered by hatred could possibly conceive. He longed to see the haughty Duchesse de Sairmeuse subjected to the vilest ignominy, Marshall in the hands of the lowest of the low. He pictured a bloody struggle in this miserable den. The sudden arrival of the police, summoned by himself, who would arrest all the parties indiscriminately. He gloated over the thought of a trial in which the crime committed at the Borderie would be brought to light. He saw the Duke and the Duchess in prison, and the great names of Sairmeuse and of Courtornieu shrouded in eternal disgrace. And he believed that nothing was wanting to ensure the success of his plans. He had at his disposal 2 miserable wretches who were capable of any crime, and an unfortunate youth named Gustave, made his willing slave by poverty and cowardice, was intended to play the part of Marianne's son. These 3 accomplices had no suspicion of his real intentions. As for the widow Chupin and her son, if they suspected some infamous plot, the name of the Duchess was all they really knew in regard to it. Moreover, Jean held Polyte and his mother completely under his control by the wealth which he had promised them if they served him docilely. And if Marshall followed his wife into the Poivrière, Jean had so arranged matters that the Duke would at first suppose that she had been led there by charity. But he will not go in, thought Lacheneur, whose heart throbbed wildly with sinister joy as he held Marshall's horse. Monsieur le Duc is too fine for that. And Marshall did not go in. Though he was horrified when he saw his wife enter that vile den, as if she were at home there, he said to himself that he should learn nothing by following her. He, therefore, contented himself by making a thorough examination of the outside of the house, then, remounting his horse, he departed on a gallop. He was completely mystified, he did not know what to think, what to imagine, what to believe. But he was fully resolved to fathom this mystery, and as soon as he returned home he sent Otto out in search of information. He could confide everything to this devoted servant, he had no secrets from him. About 4 o'clock his faithful valet de chambre returned, an expression of profound consternation visible upon his countenance. "What is it?" asked Marshall, divining some great misfortune. Ah, sir, the mistress of that wretched den is the widow of Chupin's son. Marshall's face became as white as his linen. He knew life too well not to understand that since the Duchess had been compelled to submit to the power of these people, they must be masters of some secret which she was willing to make any sacrifice to preserve. But what secret? The years which had silvered Marshall's hair, had not cooled the ardor of his blood. He was, as he had always been, a man of impulses. He rushed to his wife's apartments. "Madame has just gone down to receive the Countess de Mussidan and the Marquise d'Arlange," said the maid. "Very well, I will wait for her here. Retire." And Marshall entered the chamber of Madame Blanche. The room was in disorder, for the Duchess, after returning from the Poivriere, was still engaged in her toilet when the visitors were announced. The wardrobe doors were open, the chairs were encumbered with wearing apparel, the articles which Madame Blanche used daily, her watch, her purse, and several bunches of keys, were lying upon the dressing table and mantel. Marshall did not sit down. His self-possession was returning. "No folly," he thought, "if I question her, I shall learn nothing. I must be silent and watchful." He was about to retire, when, on glancing about the room, his eyes fell upon a large casket, inlaid with silver, which had belonged to his wife ever since she was a young girl, and which accompanied her everywhere. "That, doubtless, holds the solution of the mystery," he said to himself. It was one of those moments when a man obeys the dictates of passion without pausing to reflect. He saw the keys upon the mantel. He seized them, and endeavored to find one that would fit the lock of the casket. The fourth key opened it. It was full of papers. With feverish haste, Marshall examined the contents. He had thrown aside several unimportant letters, when he came to a bill that read as follows: "Search for the child of Madame de Sermeuse. Expenses for the third quarter of the year 18. Marshall's brain reeled. A child. His wife had a child. He read on, "For services of 2 agents at Sermeuse. For expenses attending my own journey. Divers gratuities. Etc., etc." The total amounted to 6,000 francs. The bill was signed Chelteuse. With a sort of cold rage, Marshall continued his examination of the contents of the casket, and found a note written in a miserable hand, that said, 2,000 francs this evening. Or I will tell the Duke the history of the affair at the Borderie. Then several more bills from Chelteuse, then a letter from Aunt Medea in which she spoke of prison and of remorse. And finally, at the bottom of the casket, he found the marriage certificate of Marie-Anne Lacheneur and Maurice d'Escorval, drawn up by the Cure of Vigano and signed by the old physician and Corporal Bavois. The truth was as clear as daylight. Stunned, frozen with horror, Marshall scarcely had strength to return the letters to the casket and restore it to its place. Then he tottered back to his own room, clinging to the walls for support. "It was she who murdered Marie-Anne," he murmured. He was confounded, terror-stricken by the perfidy and baseness of this woman who was his wife, by her criminal audacity, by her cool calculation and assurance, by her marvelous powers of dissimulation. He swore he would discover all, either through the Duchess or through the widow Chupin, and he ordered Otto to procure a costume for him such as was generally worn by the habitués of the Poivriere. He did not know how soon he might have use for it. This happened early in February, and from that moment Madame Blanche did not take a single step without being watched. Not a letter reached her that her husband had not previously read. And she had not the slightest suspicion of the constant espionage to which she was subjected. Marshall did not leave his room, he pretended to be ill. To meet his wife and be silent, was beyond his powers. He remembered the oath of vengeance which he had pronounced over Marie-Anne's lifeless form too well. But there were no new revelations, and for this reason, Pauline Chupin had been arrested under charge of theft, and this accident caused a delay in the execution of Lacheneur's plans. But, at last, he judged that all would be in readiness on the 20th of February, Shrove Sunday. The evening before the widow Chupin, in conformance with his instructions, wrote to the Duchess that she must come to the Poivriere Sunday evening at 11 o'clock. On that same evening Jean was to meet his accomplices at a ball at the Rainbow, a public house bearing a very unenviable reputation, and give them their last instructions. These accomplices were to open the scene. He was to appear only in the denouement. All is well arranged, the mechanism will work of its own accord, he said to himself. But the mechanism, as he styled it, failed to work. Madame Blanche, on receiving the widow Chupin's summons, revolted for a moment. The lateness of the hour, the isolation of the spot designated, frightened her. But she was obliged to submit, and on the appointed evening she furtively left the house, accompanied by Camille, the same servant who had witnessed Aunt Medea's last agony. The Duchess and her maid were attired like women of the very lowest order, and felt no fear of being seen or recognized. And yet a man was watching them, and he quickly followed them. It was Martial. Knowing of this rendezvous even before his wife, he had disguised himself in the costume Otto had procured for him, which was that of a laborer about the quays. And, as he was a man who did perfectly whatever he attempted to do, he had succeeded in rendering himself unrecognizable. His hair and beard were rough and matted, his hands were soiled and grimed with dirt. He was really the abject wretch whose rags he wore. Otto had begged to be allowed to accompany him, but the Duke refused, saying that the revolver which he would take with him would be sufficient protection. He knew Otto well enough, however, to be certain he would disobey him. 10 o'clock was sounding when Madame Blanche and Camille left the house, and it did not take them 5 minutes to reach the Rue Taranne. There was one fiacre on the stand, one only. They entered it and it drove away. This circumstance drew from Martial an oath worthy of his costume. Then he reflected that, since he knew where to find his wife, a slight delay in finding a carriage did not matter. He soon obtained one. And the coachman, thanks to a pourboire of 10 francs, drove to the Rue du Château de Rentiers as fast as his horses could go. But the Duke had scarcely set foot on the ground before he heard the rumbling of another carriage which stopped abruptly at a little distance. Otto is evidently following me, he thought. And he started across the open space in the direction of the Poivrière. Gloom and silence prevailed on every side, and were made still more oppressive by a chill fog that heralded an approaching thaw. Martial stumbled and slipped at almost every step upon the rough, snow-covered ground. It was not long before he could distinguish a dark mass in the midst of the fog. It was the Poivrière. The light within filtered through the heart-shaped openings in the blinds, looking at a distance like lurid eyes gleaming in the darkness. Could it really be possible that the Duchesse de Sairmeuse was there? Martial cautiously approached the window, and clinging to the hinges of one of the shutters, he lifted himself up so he could peer through the opening. Yes, his wife was indeed there in that vile den. She and Camille were seated at a table before a large punch bowl, and in company with 2 ragged, leering scoundrels, and a soldier, quite youthful in appearance. In the center of the room stood the widow Chupin, with a small glass in her hand, talking volubly and punctuating her sentences by copious draughts of brandy. The impression produced upon Martial was so terrible that his hold relaxed and he dropped to the ground. A ray of pity penetrated his soul, for he vaguely realized the frightful suffering which had been the chastisement of the murderess. But he desired another glance at the interior of the hovel, and he again lifted himself up to the opening and looked in. The old woman had disappeared, the young soldier had risen from the table and was talking and gesticulating earnestly. Madame Blanche and Camille were listening to him with the closest attention. The 2 men who were sitting face to face, with their elbows upon the table, were looking at each other, and Martial saw them exchange a significant glance. He was not wrong. The scoundrels were plotting a rich haul. Madame Blanche, who had dressed herself with such care, that to render her disguise perfect she had encased her feet in large, coarse shoes that were almost killing her, Madame Blanche had forgotten to remove her superb diamond earrings. She had forgotten them, but Lacheneur's accomplices had noticed them, and were now regarding them with eyes that glittered more brilliantly than the diamonds themselves. While awaiting Lacheneur's coming, these wretches, as had been agreed upon, were playing the part which he had imposed upon them. For this, and their assistance afterward, they were to receive a certain sum of money. But they were thinking that this sum was not, perhaps, a quarter part of the value of these jewels, and they exchanged glances that said, "Ah! If we could only get them and make our escape before Lacheneur comes." The temptation was too strong to be resisted. One of them rose suddenly, and, seizing the Duchess by the back of the neck, he forced her head down upon the table. The diamonds would have been torn from the ears of Madame Blanche had it not been for Camille, who bravely came to the aid of her mistress. Martial could endure no more. He sprang to the door of the hovel, opened it, and entered, bolting it behind him. "Martial! Monsieur Lecoq!" These cries escaping the lips of Madame Blanche and Camille in the same breath, changed the momentary stupor of their assailants into fury, and they both precipitated themselves upon Martial, determined to kill him. With a spring to one side, Martial avoided them. He had his revolver in his hand, he fired twice and the wretches fell. But he was not yet safe, for the young soldier threw himself upon him, and attempted to disarm him. Through all the furious struggle, Martial did not cease crying, in a panting voice, "Fly! Blanche, fly! Otto is not far off. The name, save the honor of the name." The two women obeyed, making their escape through the back door, which opened upon the garden, and they had scarcely done so, before a violent knocking was heard at the front door. The police were coming. This increased Martial's frenzy. And with one supreme effort to free himself from his assailant, he gave him such a violent push that his adversary fell, striking his head against the corner of the table, after which he lay like one dead. But the widow Chupin, who had come downstairs on hearing the uproar, was shrieking upon the stairs. At the door someone was crying, "Open in the name of the law." Martial might have fled. But if he fled, the Duchess might be captured, for he would certainly be pursued. He saw the peril at a glance, and his decision was made. He shook the widow Chupin violently by the arm, and said, in an imperious voice, "If you know how to hold your tongue you shall have 100,000 francs. Then, drawing a table before the door opening into the adjoining room, he entrenched himself behind it as behind a rampart, and awaited the approach of the enemy. The next moment the door was forced open, and a squad of police, under the command of Inspector Gevril, entered the room. "Surrender," cried the inspector. Martial did not move, his pistol was turned upon the intruder. "If I can parley with them, and hold them in check only 2 minutes, all may yet be saved," he thought. He obtained the wished-for delay. Then he threw his weapon to the ground, and was about to bound through the back door, when a policeman, who had gone round to the rear of the house, seized him about the body, and threw him to the floor. From this side he expected only assistance, so he cried, "Lost! It is the Prussians who are coming." In the twinkling of an eye he was bound, and 2 hours later he was an inmate of the station house at the Place d'Italie. He had played his part so perfectly, that he had deceived even Gevril. The other participants in the broil were dead, and he could rely upon the widow Chupin. But he knew that the trap had been set for him by Jean Lacheneur. And he read a whole volume of suspicion in the eyes of the young officer who had cut off his retreat, and who was called Lecoq by his companions. Chapter 55. The Duc de Sermeuse was one of those men who remain superior to all fortuitous circumstances, good or bad. He was a man of vast experience, and great natural shrewdness. His mind was quick to act, and fertile in resources. But when he found himself immured in the damp and loathsome station house, after the terrible scenes at the Poivriere, he relinquished all hope. Martial knew that justice does not trust to appearances, and that when she finds herself confronted by a mystery, she does not rest until she has fathomed it. Martial knew, only too well, that if his identity was established, the authorities would endeavor to discover the reason of his presence at the Poivriere. That this reason would soon be discovered, he could not doubt, and, in that case, the crime at the Borderie, and the guilt of the Duchess, would undoubtedly be made public. This meant the court of assizes, prison, a frightful scandal, dishonor, eternal disgrace. And the power he had wielded in former days was a positive disadvantage to him now. His place was now filled by his political adversaries. Among them were two personal enemies upon whom he had inflicted those terrible wounds of vanity which are never healed. What an opportunity for revenge this would afford them! At the thought of this ineffaceable stain upon the great name of Sairmeuse, which was his pride and his glory, reason almost forsook him. "My God, inspire me," he murmured. "How shall I save the honor of the name?" He saw but one chance of salvation, death. They now believed him one of the miserable wretches that haunt the suburbs of Paris. If he were dead they would not trouble themselves about his identity. It is the only way, he thought. He was endeavoring to find some means of accomplishing his plan of self-destruction, when he heard a bustle and confusion outside. In a few moments the door was opened and a man was thrust into the same cell, a man who staggered a few steps, fell heavily to the floor, and began to snore loudly. It was only a drunken man. But a gleam of hope illumined Martial's heart, for in the drunken man he recognized Otto, disguised, almost unrecognizable. It was a bold ruse and no time must be lost in profiting by it. Martial stretched himself upon a bench, as if to sleep, in such a way that his head was scarcely a yard from that of Otto. "The Duchess is out of danger," murmured the faithful servant. "For today, perhaps. But tomorrow, through me, all will be known." "Have you told them who you are?" "No, all the policemen but one took me for a vagabond." "You must continue to personate this character." "What good will it do?" "Lacheneur will betray me." But Martial, though he little knew it, had no need to fear Lacheneur for the present, at least. A few hours before, on his way from the Rainbow to the Poivriere, Jean had been precipitated to the bottom of a stone quarry, and had fractured his skull. The laborers, on returning to their work early in the morning, found him lying there senseless, and at that very moment they were carrying him to the hospital. Although Otto was ignorant of this circumstance, he did not seem discouraged. "There will be some way of getting rid of Lacheneur," said he, "if you will only sustain your present character. An escape is an easy matter when a man has millions at his command. They will ask me who I am, whence I came, how I have lived. You speak English and German, tell them that you have just returned from foreign lands, that you were a foundling and that you have always lived a roving life. How can I prove this?" Otto drew a little nearer his master, and said, impressively, "We must agree upon our plans, for our success depends upon a perfect understanding between us. I have a sweetheart in Paris, and no one knows our relations. She is as sharp as steel. Her name is Milner, and she keeps the Hôtel de Marienbourg, on the St. Quentin. You can say that you arrived here from Leipzig on Sunday, that you went to this hotel. That you left your trunk there, and that this trunk is marked with the name of May, foreign artist." "Capital," said Martial, approvingly. And then, with extraordinary quickness and precision, they agreed, point by point, upon their plan of defense. When all had been arranged, Otto pretended to awake from the heavy sleep of intoxication. He clamored to be released, and the keeper finally opened the door and set him at liberty. Before leaving the station house, however, he succeeded in throwing a note to the widow Chupin, who was imprisoned in the other compartment. So, when Lecoq, after his skillful investigations at the Poivriere, rushed to the Place d'Italie, panting with hope and ambition, he found himself outwitted by these men, who were inferior to him in penetration, but whose finesse was superior to his own. Martial's plans being fully formed, he intended to carry them out with absolute perfection of detail, and, after his removal to prison, the Duc de Sairmeuse was preparing himself for the visit of the judge of instruction. When Maurice d'Escorval entered, they recognized each other. They were both terribly agitated, and the examination was an examination only in name. After the departure of Maurice, Martial attempted to destroy himself. He had no faith in the generosity of his former enemy. But when he found M. Segmuller occupying Maurice's place the next morning, Martial believed that he was saved. Then began that struggle between the judge and Lecoq on one side, and the accused on the other, a struggle from which neither party came out conqueror. Marshall knew that Lecoq was the only person he had to fear, still he bore him no ill will. Faithful to his nature, which compelled him to be just even to his enemies, he could not help admiring the astonishing penetration and perseverance of this young policeman who, undismayed by the obstacles and discouragements that surrounded him, struggled on, unassisted, to reach the truth. But Lecoq was always outwitted by Otto, the mysterious accomplice, who seemed to know his every movement in advance. At the morgue, at the Hôtel de Mariembourg, with Toynen, the wife of Polyte Chupin, as well as with Polyte Chupin himself, Lecoq was just a little too late. Lecoq detected the secret correspondence between the prisoner and his accomplice. He was even ingenious enough to discover the key to it, but this served no purpose. A man, who had seen a rival, or rather, a future master, in Lecoq had betrayed him. If his efforts to arrive at the truth through the jeweler and the Marquis d'Arlange had failed, it was only because Madame Blanche had not purchased the diamond earrings she wore at the Poivriere at any shop, but from one of her friends, the Baroness de Watchau. And lastly, if no one at Paris had missed the Duc de Sermuz, it was because, thanks to an understanding between the Duchess, Otto, and Camille, no other inmate of the Hôtel de Sermuz suspected his absence. All the servants supposed their master confined to his room by illness. They prepared all sorts of gruels and broths for him, and his breakfast and dinner were taken to his apartments every day. So the weeks went by, and Marshall was expecting to be summoned before the Court of Assizes and condemned under the name of May, when he was afforded an opportunity to escape. Too shrewd not to discern the trap that had been set for him, he endured some moments of horrible hesitation in the prison van. He decided to accept the risk, however, commending himself to his lucky star. And he decided wisely, for that same night he leaped his own garden wall, leaving, as a hostage, in the hands of Lecoq, an escaped convict, Joseph Conturier by name, whom he had picked up in a low drinking saloon. Warned by Madame Milner, thanks to a blunder on the part of Lecoq, Otto was awaiting his master. In the twinkling of an eye Marshall's beard fell under the razor, he plunged into the bath that was awaiting him, and his clothing was burned. And it was he who, during the search a few minutes later, had the hardihood to call out, "Otto, by all means allow these men to do their duty." But he did not breathe freely until the agents of police had departed. At last, he exclaimed, "Honor is saved. We have outwitted Lecoq." He had just left the bath, and enveloped himself in a robe de chambre, when Otto handed him a letter from the Duchess. He hastily broke the seal and read, "You are safe. You know all. I am dying. Farewell. I loved you." With 2 bounds he reached his wife's apartments. The door was locked, he burst it open. Too late. Madame Blanche was dead, poisoned, like Marianne. But she had procured a drug whose effect was instantaneous, and extended upon her couch, clad in her wonted apparel, her hands folded upon her breast, she seemed only asleep. A tear glittered in Marshall's eye. "Poor, unhappy woman," he murmured. "May God forgive you as I forgive you, you whose crime has been so frightfully expiated here below." Epilogue. The first success. Safe, in his own princely mansion, and surrounded by an army of retainers, the Duc de Sermuz triumphantly exclaimed, "We have outwitted Lecoq." In this he was right. But he thought himself forever beyond the reach of the wily, keen-witted detective, and in this he was wrong. Lecoq was not the man to sit down with folded hands and brood over the humiliation of his defeat. Before he went to Father Tabret, he was beginning to recover from his stupor and despondency. And when he left that experienced detective's presence, he had regained his courage, his command over his faculties, and sufficient energy to move the world, if necessary. "Well, my good man," he remarked to Father Absinthe, who was trotting along by his side, "you have heard what the great Monsieur Tabret said, did you not? So you see I was right." But his companion evinced no enthusiasm. "Yes, you were right," he responded, in woebegone tones. "Do you think we are ruined by 2 or 3 mistakes? Nonsense. I will soon turn our defeat of today into a glorious victory. Ah! You might do so perhaps, if they do not dismiss us from the force. This doleful remark recalled Lecoq to a realizing sense of the present situation. They had allowed a prisoner to slip through their fingers. That was vexatious, it is true. But they had captured one of the most notorious of criminals, Joseph Conturier. Surely there was some comfort in that. But while Lecoq could have borne dismissal, he could not endure the thought that he would not be allowed to follow up this affair of the Poivriere. What would his superior officers say when he told them that May and the Duc de Sermeuse were one and the same person? They would, undoubtedly, shrug their shoulders and turn up their noses. Still, Monsieur Segmuller will believe me, he thought. But will he dare to take any action in the matter without incontrovertible evidence? This was very unlikely. Lecoq realized it all too well. Could we not make a descent upon the Hôtel de Sermeuse, and, on some pretext or other, compel the Duke to show himself, and identify him as the prisoner May? He entertained this idea only for an instant, then abruptly dismissed it. A stupid expedient, he exclaimed. Are two such men as the Duke and his accomplice likely to be caught napping? They are prepared for such a visit, and we should only have our labor for our pains. He made these reflections sotto voce. And Father Absinthe's curiosity was aroused. Excuse me, said he, I did not quite understand you. I say that we must find some tangible proof before asking permission to proceed further. He paused with knitted brows. In seeking a circumstance which would establish the complicity between some member of the Duke's household and the witnesses who had been called upon to give their testimony, Lecoq thought of Madame Milner, the owner of the Hôtel de Mariembourg, and his first meeting with her. He saw her again, standing upon a chair, her face on a level with a cage, covered with a large piece of black silk, persistently repeating 3 or 4 German words to a starling, who as persistently retorted, Camille. Where is Camille? One thing is certain, resumed Lecoq, if Madame Milner, who is a German and who speaks with the strongest possible German accent, had raised this bird, it would either have spoken German or with the same accent as its mistress. Therefore it cannot have been in her possession long, and who gave it to her? Father Absinthe began to grow impatient. In sober earnest, what are you talking about? He asked, petulantly. I say that if there is someone at the Hôtel de Sermeuse named Camille, I have the proof I desire. Come, Papa Absinthe, let us hurry on. And without another word of explanation, he dragged his companion rapidly along. When they reached the Rue de Crenelle, Lecoq saw a messenger leaning against the door of a wine shop. Lecoq called him. Come, my boy, said he, I wish you to go to the Hôtel de Sermeuse and ask for Camille. Tell her that her uncle is waiting her here. But, sir. What, you have not gone yet? The messenger departed. The 2 policemen entered the wine shop, and Father Absinthe had scarcely had time to swallow a glass of brandy when the lad returned. Monsieur, I was unable to see Mademoiselle Camille. The house is closed from top to bottom. The Duchess died very suddenly this morning. Ah! The wretch, exclaimed the young policeman. Then, controlling himself, he mentally added. He must have killed his wife on returning home, but his fate is sealed. Now, I shall be allowed to continue my investigations. In less than 20 minutes they arrived at the Palais de Justice. M. Segmuller did not seem to be immoderately surprised at Lecoq's revelations. Still he listened with evident doubt to the young policeman's ingenious deductions. It was the circumstance of the starling that seemed to decide him. Perhaps you are right, my dear Lecoq, he said, at last. And to tell the truth, I quite agree with you. But I can take no further action in the matter until you can furnish proof so convincing in its nature that the Duc de Sermeuse will be unable to think of denying it. Ah! Sir, my superior officers will not allow me. On the contrary, interrupted the judge, they will allow you the fullest liberty after I have spoken to them. Such action on the part of M. Segmuller required not a little courage. There had been so much laughter about M. Segmuller's grand seigneur, disguised as a clown, that many men would have sacrificed their convictions to the fear of ridicule. "And when will you speak to them?" inquired Lecoq, timidly. "At once." The judge had already turned toward the door when the young policeman stopped him. "I have one more favor to ask, monsieur," he said, entreatingly. "You are so good, you are the first person who gave me any encouragement, who had faith in me. Speak, my brave fellow." "Ah! Monsieur, will you not give me a message for Monsieur d'Escorval? Any insignificant message, inform him of the prisoner's escape. I will be the bearer of the message, and then, oh! Fear nothing, monsieur. I will be prudent." "Very well," replied the judge. When he left the office of his chief, Lecoq was fully authorized to proceed with his investigations, and in his pocket was a note for M. d'Escorval from Segmuller. His joy was so intense that he did not deign to notice the sneers which were bestowed upon him as he passed through the corridors. On the threshold his enemy Gevrol, the so-called general, was watching for him. "Ah, ha!" he laughed, as Lecoq passed out, "here is one of those simpletons who fish for whales and do not catch even a gudgeon." For an instant Lecoq was angry. He turned abruptly and looked Gevrol full in the face. "That is better than assisting prisoners to carry on a surreptitious correspondence with people outside," he retorted, in the tone of a man who knows what he is saying. In his surprise, Gevrol almost lost countenance, and his blush was equivalent to a confession. But Lecoq said no more. What did it matter to him now if Gevrol had betrayed him? Was he not about to win a glorious revenge? He spent the remainder of the day in preparing his plan of action, and in thinking what he should say when he took M. Segmuller's note to Maurice d'Escorval. The next morning about 11 o'clock he presented himself at the house of M. d'Escorval. "Monsieur is in his study with a young man," replied the servant, "but, as he gave me no orders to the contrary, you may go in." Lecoq entered. The study was unoccupied. But from the adjoining room, separated from the study only by a velvet portière, came a sound of stifled exclamations, and of sobs mingled with kisses. Not knowing whether to remain or retire, the young policeman stood for a moment undecided. Then he observed an open letter lying upon the carpet. Impelled to do it by an impulse stronger than his own will, Lecoq picked up the letter. It read as follows. "The bearer of this letter is Marie-Anne's son, Maurice, your son. I have given him all the proofs necessary to establish his identity. It was to his education that I consecrated the heritage of my poor Marie-Anne. Those to whose care I confided him have made a noble man of him. If I restore him to you, it is only because the life I lead is not a fitting life for him. Yesterday, the miserable woman who murdered my sister died from poison administered by her own hand. Poor Marie-Anne. She would have been far more terribly avenged had not an accident which happened to me, saved the Duc and the Duchesse de Sairmeuse from the snare into which I had drawn them. Jean Lacheneur." Lecoq stood as if petrified. Now he understood the terrible drama which had been enacted in the widow Chupin's cabin. "I must go to Sairmeuse at once," he said to himself, "there I can discover all." He departed without seeing M. d'Escorval. He resisted the temptation to take the letter with him. It was exactly 1 month to a day after the death of Madame Blanche. Reclining upon a divan in his library, the Duc de Sairmeuse was engaged in reading, when Otto, his valet de chambre, came to inform him that a messenger was below, charged with delivering into the Duke's own hands a letter from M. Maurice d'Escorval. With a bound, Marshall was on his feet. "Is it possible?" he exclaimed. Then he added, quickly, "Let the messenger enter." A large man, with a very florid complexion, and red hair and beard, timidly handed the Duke a letter. He broke the seal, and read. "I saved you, monsieur, by not recognizing the prisoner, may. In your turn, aid me. By noon, day after tomorrow, I must have 2 160,000 francs. I have sufficient confidence in your honor to apply to you. Maurice d'Escorval. For a moment Marshall stood bewildered, then, springing to a table, he began writing, without noticing that the messenger was looking over his shoulder. Monsieur, not day after tomorrow, but this evening. My fortune and my life are at your disposal. It is but a slight return for the generosity you showed in retiring, when, beneath the rags of May, you recognized your former enemy, now your devoted friend. Marshal de Sermuz. He folded this letter with a feverish hand, and giving it to the messenger with a Louis, he said, "Here is the answer, make haste." But the messenger did not go. He slipped the letter into his pocket, then with a hasty movement he cast his red beard and wig upon the floor. "Lecoq," exclaimed Marshall, paler than death. "Lecoq, yes, monsieur," replied the young detective. "I was obliged to take my revenge. My future depended upon it, and I ventured to imitate Monsieur d'Escorval's writing." And as Marshall made no response, "I must also say to Monsieur Lecoq," he continued, "that on transmitting to the judge the confession written by the Duke's own hand, of his presence at the Poivriere, I can and shall, at the same time, furnish proofs of his entire innocence. And to show that he was ignorant of nothing," he added, "as Madame is dead, there will be nothing said in regard to what took place at the Borderie." A week later a verdict of not guilty was rendered by M. Segmuller in the case of the Duc de Sermuz. Appointed to the position he coveted, Lecoq had the good taste, or perhaps the shrewdness, to wear his honors modestly. But on the day of his promotion, he ordered a seal, upon which was engraved the exultant rooster, which he had chosen as his armorial design, and a motto to which he ever remained faithful, Semper Vigilant.